I will plug you in. Fresh from the creative school of hard knocks, I've developed my own reality of what I think it takes to produce something great. It takes blind optimism, not too much practicality, and a plan that so boxes you in there's no escape. It's a lot like climbing in a small boat to sail around the world. Once you're out on the high seas, you are committed. If you don't completely box yourself in, you really run the risk that at some point, common sense is going to enter the picture and it will defeat your mad plan. With a nuclear physicist as a father, you realize at a really young age that they don't make mistakes. If they do make mistakes, they're huge mistakes. And so I grew up with the concept that you do everything possible to avoid mistakes. I realized at a much later point in my life that my father, because his brain worked in a certain way to really hyper-focus on nuclear physics, he did not have the capacity to understand how other people could live a quality life that was very different than his experience. He understood his experience and the way he made his choices, and those were the only ones that really made sense to him. So I had to toughen myself up by sort of valuing myself and valuing being an artist and being a musician and doing things that were not scientific. And then I would go in the summers and work for my Grandpa Jack, who was wonderful because he had a farm and I could be a boy working up there, and he was a problem solver. Things would go wrong every day on a farm, and it was up to him to figure it out. And he had a saying all the time, which was, it's just one of those things. We'd be out in the combine going along and we'd hit a rock and it would break teeth on the combine, and he'd swear a little bit, take a shot of his Jim Beam whiskey, and then pull out some wrenches and we'd start fixing it. It was sort of like, okay, we have 1 minute to have a little hissy fit about what's just happened, and then we don't have any more time to like moan about it. Let's fix it, and then we go on. And so I started to get a much looser feel that doing things is an adventure, and be open to it. Things are going to go wrong, but when they do, you'll figure it out, you'll fix them, and then you'll move to the next step. So at 12 years old, I was in a rock band, not a good one. We were loud, that was our specialty. And I went to my parents and said, hey, I'd like to buy a 12-string guitar. And I had enough money saved up from the little gigs that we had played to buy one. And they said, no, you have a guitar, save your money. And at 12 years old, you don't want to save your money. So I just started wood shop, and I said, how about if I buy the wood, can I build my own? And I think it was just one of those moments where your parents can't say no to you, although they didn't think I had any ability to make a guitar. And so I told my guitar teacher at the time that I was going to be making this guitar. And I could see just a slight bit of doubt in his face, but he was really supportive and nice. But he knew an old guy named Tom. He built fiddles, and he built sort of Fender kind of Stratocaster guitar-shaped guitars, and he was a country western guy. And I remember my guitar teacher telling me, "Oh, Tom's a great guy. He's as common as an old boot." And he was, but he thought I was a cool 12-year-old kid. And he just said, "Hey, anytime you want to come over," he would set me up in his shop, and sometimes I'd sweep, and sometimes I'd sand boards. But he took me through all the stages on the first guitar. And when it played, oh my gosh, what an amazing thing that was. Between 12 and 18, I make 30 guitars, but never really thought of it as I would ever make a living at that. It was just a really interesting, fun thing to do. I knew that I could do it, and I knew what the thrill of making something that was unlike a piece of furniture that you could sit at, that a musical instrument in my hands or in somebody else's hands was like an amazing magic trick. There's such a payoff to making a musical instrument. And so in the back of my mind, I had guitar making somewhere as a real joy, but not really as something that I would ever do for a living. I studied architecture for a couple of years and took a film class and just got hooked on animation and thought, wow, that's what I want to do. So I went to California Institute of the Arts and graduated from there and went into animation. I did a lot of medical films and science films and Sesame Street and television, and finally got to Disney, and I was at Disney for 18 years. And I started out as an artist, as an animator, and eventually became a department head, an artistic coordinator, and finally a producer of Chicken Little and Emperor's New Groove. When I had been there 18 years, I had just finished Chicken Little. I think I had one of those epiphany moments where you think, wow, that's like being born and graduating from high school. And I loved my time at Disney, but I realized I had been there long enough. I think everybody always admires a ball player that kind of knows when the time's up before they've had 2 or 3 years where they never even get in the game because their Achilles tendon is blown out or something. So I just had a sense, okay, this is about time to make a change. Also, I had enough artistic experience to start to develop a belief in what I could do if I just focused and had a confidence that if left alone to do what made sense to me, that things would go well. You get that confidence because there are certain days at a studio where nobody interrupts anything that you're doing, and you get into an amazing workflow with like-minded people and things happen. And so you think, wow, I could maybe do that all the time. When I sort of looked back over my career of starting as an artist and then being a supervisor and then being a supervisor of more and more people and then pretty much not being an artist, I thought, what point in that evolution would I want to return to? And, you know, honestly, too, what would I give up to go back to that? You work your way up the ladder and you have an assistant that does a lot of things for you. and all of a sudden now you go back down the food chain. I love the old-time saying that a camel is a horse designed by a committee. And that makes me laugh every time I think about that saying. But the Disney company was a great teacher to me to know that if you get too many collaborators in the soup, even though everybody means well, everybody wants a success, you get to a point where you go, you know what? There's a reason why a singular artistic vision, it has a value to it. We just had the Olympics, and watching the baton being passed in a 4-person relay race, you know, okay, each one of those 4 guys that's on that relay team, they're going to smoke. They're really fast runners. The critical nervous time is always when they're handing the baton off to the next guy, and how smoothly is that going to go? There's, I think, an amazing camaraderie and team spirit and satisfaction in winning a 4-person relay race. And I think creatively, we all have our own ideas in our own head. Even though we think we're explaining it very clearly to somebody else, sometimes it's not quite as clear to them as what we thought we were explaining. I don't have to break any rhythm to explain it to anybody else, nor do I think at points in my creative process could I really explain it very well and have someone leave the room and go do what I said and have it come out well. Because while they were off doing it, I might have 3 or 4 other refined ideas of how I would do it. Coming from the film industry, most people would agree when you don't mess around enough with the director and you actually let him direct the movie without too many audience suggestions, that's usually the best. So if you believe in a singular vision as an artist and you have confidence in yourself, the more steps that you're willing to do on whatever your project, the more it's going to be your vision. So now back to me, the luxury that I have working by myself. I don't have to explain my idea to anyone. And I can start on something without 100% it all fleshed out as to how I'm going to do something. And I have a confidence about what I can do now. And I just have to go do it. I have to go test it. I could go down in flames or it could be glorious. I left Disney in 2006, and I had some savings. Shortly after that, the economy tanks, the stock market goes way down. I start investing money in materials, in pickups and everything. And so rather quickly, this big padding of money that you thought you had set aside, you know, I've got a safety net in case anything goes wrong, you realize, okay, I have to take myself seriously. I'm now in business. I made a little calculation early on and decided I was making about 1/10 of what I had made at the studio at one point. Of course, that's going to get a little better, and it has gotten better. But when you stop what you're doing, that especially a career that you've been doing for 25 or 30 years, and leave all the cushiness and whatever you've built up in that career, and you go back to square one and say, now I'm going to do something completely different, and I'm going to do it on my own. It would be very unrealistic to expect that you could hit that same level at all. And to me, I had lower expectations and just said, if I can actually have more money coming in than's going out, if I can pay the bills, if I can make up for how wonderful the stock market is, that'll be enough. That'll be enough. I decided, like most any business that wants to succeed, you want to start out as lean as you possibly can. So I started working at my house. And when it came to the drudgery work, I was going to do it all myself. The bane of any guitar maker's existence is how much sanding you have to do, how much shaping and getting out every last scratch, and you're making a high-end instrument, it's got to be perfect. I decided that drudgery work, I would have to mentally think of that in a different way. I can't beat myself up for, gee, when I was at Disney, I had people that would help me do all those kind of things, and now I'm on my own and it's all up to me or it doesn't get done. Now when I sand things and I do things that would be considered drudgery to a lot of people, my hands are doing what they're doing, and I'm daydreaming about the next things that I'm going to be doing. I'm thinking, I'm planning, and I actually enjoy that time. It's just the same thing as when you're driving to and from work. It gives you space to really be creative and think about things. I came up with this idea, well, I'll make 12 bass guitars. I'll use many different wood combinations, and it'll be my science lab. I'll go through all 12 and I'll see how they come out. And if I have a few disasters in there, that's okay. It's all about learning. And if you want to do something at a high level, you have to take some chances. Otherwise, you're just going to repeat something that everybody else has done. I remember hearing a fellow who was an investment guru who said, you know what, I have to be right more than 50% of the time. That always stuck with me, that there's a guy admitting, you know, if I'm wrong more than 50%, I'm out of business. But I don't have to be right 100% of the time to do my job. I just have to be right more than I'm wrong. So if you have that kind of a more loose philosophy, you allow yourself to try some things that with no guarantee that they're all going to come out. I knew guitar players from Disney that were really good, and I would make them a guitar and get feedback from them. From Leo Fender, his whole thing was to hand out his instruments to country western players and have them take them for a month and give him feedback, and then he would make adjustments based on that. So you've got the best players in the world test marketing your instrument and telling you what's good about it. Just little things, discomforts with the thickness of the neck or the width of something or the string spacing. And of course everybody's slightly different, but you start to get a pattern of what's working and what isn't, and you make subtle adjustments. So I jumped in to building bass guitars. I built one for Jimmy Haslip. I thought, Abraham Laboriel. Actually, I'd worked with Abraham Laboriel at Disney at one point and thought he was the most amazing guy I'd ever met. So I got hooked up with him through mutual friends and had him come over to the house and try out some of my bass guitars. And he stayed something like 6 hours. And he played every bass I had and gave me really unbelievably usable notes on each one. Not criticism so much as, wow, in the studio I would use this for reggae. Here's how I would dial this one.
Wow.
So that's what I did. I built him this bass guitar, and also through another mutual friend, James Lomenzo, who was in Megadeth at the time, I built him a radical heavy metal bass guitar that couldn't be more different than the one I built for Abraham. And they both came over to the house the same day to try out their new basses, and so we filmed it.
Nobody can do that for this bass. Well, let me tell you, there's a beautiful man named Randall Wyn that said to me, bring your favorite instruments so that I can come up with an idea of what kind of an instrument I should make for you. And what happened is that he concluded that I love to play the guitar.
And we ended up deciding that what he really needed was a 6-string bass guitar tuned an octave lower than a regular guitar, because he's a fantastic flamenco guitarist and a great bass player. And let's build him a 6-string instrument that he could do both. He could go back and forth between his bass and his guitar playing.
And that's why I told the audience, this is a very unusual instrument. It's a very special instrument because it allows me to cross over into the guitar kingdom without losing track of my function as a bass player. I love playing the instrument. First of all, it obeys.
Yeah.
Second of all, my friends that I'm playing with love the sound. And third of all, it's an instrument that inspires me to continue to keep playing.
Yeah.
And it's a great advantage and a blessing to have a tool or an instrument that says, don't put me down, keep going, keep on going, keep on going. Randy, thank you so much for extending your love and craftsmanship to my life here.
And I thank you too, because when I hear you play it, I take myself seriously. I think to myself, oh my God, I must know what I'm doing. Most of the time I don't, but when you're playing, I do.
Thank you so much, and
Yes.
This is an unforgettable night, man.
At that point, I had built 20 bass guitars. I assumed I would have some failures in that, but whatever came out, I would learn some things. I kept making more refinements. I made another 10 or 12, and I ended up with 22 bass guitars, and finally thought it's time to go to the NAMM show. It's like it's time to take your prize bull to the county fair and just see how it goes. We've all been to a trade show and there's that one booth and everybody just walks by and nobody stops. I just had a nightmare about what if nobody stops at my booth? There's 100 people that are making incredible bass guitars out there. How am I gonna ever break through? Who's gonna notice what I'm doing? I mean, there's tons of people that have done it way longer than me. And I laugh to myself because that's kind of the point you go through with every movie that you ever work on. Whenever you start a movie, you think, hey, this is an incredible idea, and you develop the characters, and it's funny, and it's all these things. And you get to a point about 2/3 of the way through where you're thinking, this isn't funny. You're used to all the jokes. You're thinking, oh, but there's such better ways we could have done this. Is there any way we can rewind and go back to the start? There's always that moment where you have to have a gut check and you have to think, wow, am I really in this thing? Am I really ready? I just kept going and thought, what the heck? And by the time the NAMM show came, I really had talked myself into a pretty loose attitude. Like, I'm just gonna go do the show. If nobody likes my bass guitars, that's okay. If they do, that's okay.
We're here at Winter NAMM 2010 with Wyn Guitars founder and sole employee,
Yes.
Randall Fullmer. Thanks for joining us.
I'm the president and I sand all the boards.
Yeah.
I do them both.
Your luthiery knowledge, skills, all self-taught?
Pretty much self-taught and trial and error and repeating what works and skipping what doesn't work.
So we're about to hear and interview James Lomenzo. Do you want to talk real briefly about the experience working on his bass in particular?
James just had seen my website and he thought I was making great stuff and said, how'd you like to make me a bass? And I said, you bet. That's what I said.
I spoke with Randall on the phone and then actually went down and met with him and saw his operation. We found out not only was he legit, but he was kind of a mad scientist in that he's totally and unabashedly engulfed in this notion of making these basses. Each have a personality, each have their own style, each have a visual personality. Again, Randall's one of these great guys who just obsesses.
Yeah, that's
Right?
true.
Absolutely. And it shows a level of artistic care that, you know, you don't really necessarily find in the guitar world en masse.
And literally all 22 basses were sold at the show. And some really top gospel players, Maurice Fitzgerald ended up getting one, and Ethan Farmer, who was a great session player and was playing with Christina Aguilera. But some of these guys that I was starting to realize could get free bass guitars from companies, that was no problem, but they couldn't get minor adjustments made that seemed relatively simple to me. And I don't have a CNC computer-controlled shaping machine. I shape everything by hand. And so, to me, if somebody wants just an 1/8 of an inch thinner neck or a slightly different contour, I just write it down and do it. I don't have to reprogram a machine. And if I were making 1,000 guitars that were all the same, absolutely you would use a CNC machine. But the way I'm doing things, everybody wants something slightly different, and I'm able to do that. That's kind of, it keeps it interesting for me, and that's my niche. That's why people come to me, really. I realized rather quickly that the bass playing community is a community. They really talk to each other, whether they're in Philadelphia or New York or Oakland. They communicate, and the word got out that I was making really good, versatile guitars. And before I knew it, I had more work than I knew what to do with. I'm now on to the next phase, which is obsessively worrying about staying up with my schedule. It never gets better, it just changes. The workload is starting to exponentially grow. I'm starting to have emails that I have to write every night to people. They're calling during the day. I'm setting up files, I'm taking deposits. I'm tracking a lot of things. The business part of my job is starting to grow. In the music industry, often a group's first album is their best. They've had 20 years to get ready for that first album. If it's a hit, the record company wants the second album in about 6 months, and at the same time the group's out trying to promote their first album. So you're very happy for the success, but you're feeling the pressure and you're feeling the time constraint to keep it going. More and more orders keep coming in. I keep building bases. I get an order for 7-string. I hadn't built a 7-string before, so I'm really excited about that and start on that one. At some point, I realized that a lot of money's going out and no money's coming in. I'm getting deposits, but all the deposits go for materials. And then I realized it's time to come up with the money for the booth at the NAMM show, and the booths are not cheap. Fortunately, I finished the 7-string bass. I thought, okay, I can get the money for that. I contacted the customer and he said, oh, I don't have the money. And then he said, in fact, I probably won't ever have the money. And I was stunned. And then when I went through my records, I realized that in my excitement to build the 7-string, I had never even gotten a deposit. So money's really tight. I'm looking for some sort of silver lining here, and I'm thinking, well, at least I'm working out of my house. I'm keeping my expenses low. And basically, I was getting ready for the NAMM show when the police knocked on the door. 2 LAPD cops with guns and batons came to my front door, and they said, we understand you're making guitars on these premises. And it was sort of like, we understand you have a meth lab in your backyard, you know? And said, well, we have to warn you that with our due diligence, we have to turn this into the city, and there will be a city inspector that's gonna appear at your door within 30 days, and they will probably tell you at that point that you have to stop right then. And here I am, I'm in the middle of making all these bass guitars, getting ready for this big show. And so I thought, wow, I better go out and find a place. As the police had promised, the inspector shows up right away. He takes a look, he says, you have a neighbor that's complained, you're gonna have to shut down your operation right now. So I plead with the inspector, I've got this big guitar show coming up, I'm looking for a new place, I've got these basses that I'm right in the middle of making, can I just finish up what I'm doing before you shut me down? He said okay, but he didn't look too happy about it. As I continued to work, he started calling me each day, and he would drive by and inspect and see if I was making progress in shutting down my operation. I was starting to feel my creative life slipping away. I feel the pressure of NAMM coming up. I'm jumping in my car, driving around town, desperately looking for a place, and I'm running out of money pretty fast. So I finally find a place. It's not cheap, but it looks like it will work. I have a stepbrother who sensed my desperation and offered to come down from Northern California and help me move into my new shop. I was sick as a dog from the NAMM show for about a month. We're packing, we're hauling, we're trying to get approvals and get wiring done. We're just trying to get everything done so that I don't fall further behind on my schedule. This was not the fun I had in mind when I left Disney. Then I start talking with the inspectors and they say, you know, now that you're going to be in a business location, all your power equipment, your machinery, it all has to be UL listed. We have to inspect it and it has to be upgraded if it doesn't meet the spec. And I looked at my machinery, none of it's UL listed. So I asked, well, how much will that cost? And he said, oh, it's not bad, it's a few $1,000s. Oh good, just a few $1,000s. It's like things happen for a reason and they all happen the way they ought to happen. And I realized once I got in my shop, it was really wonderful to postpone getting into the shop until I'd really figured out the tools that I was going to be using and my different operations. Because once I moved into the shop, I knew exactly how to set it up. I can find everything, everything's efficient. You know, it's really, really perfect. So here's my shop. What I have is 1,500 square feet with a really, really nice tall ceiling. Ever since 8th grade wood shop, I wanted a tall building where I could build this giant rack for lumber so that I can store it up and down. When you have to store your lumber down flat with an 8-foot ceiling, you quickly realize the favorite board that you have is always on the bottom of the pile. These boards here are the body core woods, mahoganies and Spanish cedar. But over here, the really chocolate brown wood is my wenge pile, which is, that's my gold. When that was delivered by a guy, he thought it was fence material. He thought it was building a fence. No, not. Anyway, the first major thing was this whole dust vacuum system. I did a number of floor plans to specifically put each machine where it's going to stay, because then I had electricians come and run wiring down 220 or 110 to each tool. And then each one of these routes comes down and they have a trap door, a door that allows suction to happen or not, so that I can always set up and use whatever tool with the suction. And it all goes, a little freeway system, into a giant vacuum cleaner. So that gets probably 90% of the sawdust, the wood chips, the shavings. And then up on the ceiling, these Delta boxes are fine air filters. That keeps the major sawdust and the major fine stuff out of here. So it's a pretty healthy working environment. I set enough space around them so that I have safe working space. Some of them are at an angle. I figured out where I could run a long board and it would continue on and not run into this saw, as an example. Have clamps. Clamps are, that's a sign of status in the woodworking world. And to have them on wheels to where I can just roll them to where I'm working. And then I put in all these shelves and I have complete organization. I can find all the wood that I'm using. For instance, these are all fretboards, from ebony to Indian rosewood, maple, cocobolo. I took the time to label where every kind of wood I have is, and I can pull it out and I can take a look. Redwood burl, my Bubinga set. So I have many, many favorites, and they're like my children's. Some of them I've sawn into thin layers. They're all ready to go on guitar tops. Some are still in the full-size billets. Up above, I keep bins of my bridges, knobs, wiring harnesses that all the electronics things that I need to keep dust-free, tuning pegs, my pickups. So everything is very organized, and I try to be as efficient as possible so I can find things quickly and you know, keep a nice workflow going. So that's my shop. So I'm going to cut more off with this saw, and it's all freehand stuff. And in a way, I almost hate to show people that I do it this way, because I think I'd be kicked out of my high school wood shop for doing it this way. It's a little on the dangerous side, but I work by myself. And boy, I keep a healthy fear at all times. I keep very focused on what I'm doing. So I'm not recommending this is the way to do it. This is just the way I do it. There was an old Dutch woodworker that I used to really admire, an old-time guy. And he was just a sculptor, and he knew Frank Lloyd Wright. He was like a real guy. And he would go out to his shop every day with no preconceived idea of what he was going to do in his shop that day. He just had stuff out there and all his tools and a wonderful working environment, and he was going to do what he felt like doing. And to a degree, I do that every day. I know I've got 40 orders, and I've got to make eventually 40 necks and 40 bodies, and I've got to solder together the electronics for 40 guitars and But certain days, you really feel like doing something way more than something else. And that's part of keeping it fun too, is to allow myself to do what I feel like. I'm very self-disciplined to where you can only postpone something you don't want to do so long, and then you just do it because it's got to be done, or you will hold yourself up. So it's time for a little musical tonewood demonstration. And I've gone through this sort of thing a lot to test out and really get a good idea of which woods sound like what. What I'm going to do is start with Buckeye Burl, which is a pretty soft and relatively dead wood, and work my way up to swamp ash and on up to the hardest woods. And you'll hear that the pitch, the loudness of the wood keeps increasing, and the pitch keeps increasing as well. So here we go. Here is Buckeye Burl, swamp ash, bird's eye maple, walnut, another piece of walnut, very different, koa, cocobolo, bubinga, Powell Faro, Wenge, ebony. Here's a different kind of Wenge. It's darker and more and brighter. And Ziricote. You could almost make music with those. There are days where I now have a shop, but it's a hot day and you're sanding all day. Wow, you have your moments where you think, how did I make a series of choices that got me to this point? So I'm half Welsh and I'm half German. And I basically feel that the Welsh part is the right brain, creative, dreamy part. The left part is the German industrialist mentality. So I sort of feel like there's always a war going on in my brain between trying to figure out the best way to make the most amazing bass and yet make it in the most efficient manner. I hope I have the common sense not to repeat what I'm currently doing. I started out to build a group of 12 basses for efficiency's sake. So if I do 12 basses, I can do 12 necks in a row, I can do 12 body wings, I can do 12 fret jobs. The orders kept arriving, and each time a customer would say, boy, I hope I can get in the next batch. Well, okay, so I would add another one, and then I kept adding. And when I got up to 20, I thought my head was going to explode, and yet I kept going until I got to 27. And now I'm just kind of hanging on by my fingernails. The problem is, if it's time to find sand, which is not my favorite part, I have to do that for 4 or 5 straight days. If it's time to solder or it's time to fret, that's 4 or 5 days in a row. And it starts to feel like really a long time since I've completed a bass and strung it up and played it, which is really the enjoyment that you get when you complete the bass. I figured I can be plenty efficient if I do 8 basses at a time. I don't have to do 27. I really want to keep this whole endeavor fun. To me, that's really critically important. I think my cat knows when I'm happy. I was having a conversation with someone about running the marathon, and you could go run alongside the marathon runner when he's about 5 miles from the ending, and you could say, hey, it doesn't look like you're having any fun. And I think the marathon runner, if he could even speak, would completely agree, you know what, at this point, I'm having no fun at all. But that's the cycle that he has to go through. And any creative project that I've ever gone through, you start out euphorically high about your idea, you hit some low point in the middle where you can't believe you ever thought it was a good idea. And it usually all comes together by the end, and you have an enormous sense of satisfaction. But just knowing that there's going to be those tough moments that you go through, that's the experience that kind of helps you get through those tough moments. You've just gone through them before. At the second NOM, Abraham Laboriel played at the booth, and it was so emotional. And I looked over, and Fernando was there. He came over and he said, you know, my brother's in Mana, and I'm a backing musician for that group, and I really like your basses. Well, here's another guy, like Abraham, is a guitar player and a bass player. And so I said, you know what, you need a bass like Abraham's. The group came through town and played at the Staples Center. He called up and said, can you come to the concert this time? And he got his tickets and said, you can come in the dressing room at the end and we can have a party. We go back and we couldn't find any place to plug in the bass. So he sets up in the men's room, and there were a whole bunch of women that were there, and pretty soon they just filled up and everybody forgot that it was the men's room.
Perdiendo el suelo, te vas sin despedida, te vas hiriendo el cielo, te vas fugaz a la eternidad. Dragón, parece un dragón, tus recuerdos quedaron salpicando fuego. Dragón, parece un dragón. Salpicando, el fuego va hiriendo el cielo. Dragón, parece un dragón. Tus recuerdos quedaron salpicando fuego. Dragón, parece un dragón. Hiriendo la eternidad.
Oh, yeah.
Cried the whole night long. Woke up this morning, my little biscuit roller, she was gone.